Thursday, October 31st, 2002. The Minneapolis city streets are ready for the holiday. A group of young college kids hit the town, all donning costumes and ready for a great time. Chris Jenkins, 21, dressed as a Native American, sits alone in the Lone Tree Bar and Grill, enjoying his drink. His friends are scattered throughout the building, all embracing the Halloween spirit. Unbeknownst to any of them, this would be the last night that Chris would live to see. Today, in honor of the spooky season and my favourite holiday, we're covering a crime that occurred on Halloween, the disappearance of Chris Jenkins. Chris was a 21-year-old college kid studying at the University of Minnesota. By all accounts, Chris was a decent guy, an athlete, a jokester, a great friend, and a smart kid. Now I love Halloween. I always have. It's the one holiday that I actually look forward to and like to celebrate. That being said, I can imagine that Chris was really excited for the night. It was his first Halloween being able to drink legally, and he was able to spend it with his closest friends. I mean, that's all the makings of a great night. But without further ado, let's dive right in. Right now, we're stood in downtown Minneapolis, just outside where the Lone Tree Bar and Grill once operated. The majority of the following timeline is based on the account of private investigator Chuck Lesh. The night began with a small party at Chris's house. The roommates had all chipped in for a keg and invited a few people over to celebrate. Chris was dressed as a Native American, and his girlfriend Ashley was dressed as a sexy cop. Now this is 2002, so just keep that in mind. But at some point between 10 and 11, Chris, Ashley, and a few of their friends decided to leave the house party and head downtown to see what was going on in the city. They parked about a block away from their final destination, the Lone Tree Bar and Grill. At this point, it was almost 11 PM, and in Minneapolis, it gets fucking cold. It got to around 20 degrees Fahrenheit or -7 degrees Celsius that night, and Chris didn't bring a jacket with him as to not ruin his costume. And since his costume didn't have any pockets, he asked Ashley if she could hold his phone, keys, and wallet. They made it to the bar, which was filled with costumed individuals, all having a great time. The friends dispersed all throughout the bar, and Chris got himself a drink. This is the point where I should probably mention that the Lone Tree was known to be a cop bar, which would kind of explain Ashley's costume. According to some witnesses, Ashley was getting hit on by cops and numerous patrons at the bar all night, which may have led to a small argument between the couple. At some point in the night, Chris accidentally spilled his drink on himself, resulting in a noticeable wet spot on his costume. An off-duty cop named Mike Casey, who was working security next door, spoke with Chris regarding the spot and asked if he had pissed himself. After this interaction, Mike reportedly told security to keep an eye on Chris. And not long after this, around 12:30 AM, Chris was removed from the Lone Tree Bar and Grill. According to the bouncers, they last saw him turning onto the Hennepin and heading north. As for the rest of the group, they enjoyed their night, unaware of the situation that just happened with Chris. They just figured that he found a ride, or maybe even walked home. His girlfriend Ashley stayed at the bar for a work meeting after closing and was given a ride home. The next day, Chris's mum tried to call them, but the phone was picked up by one of his roommates. Chris's family kind of figured that something was wrong, and called around to all of his friends, but no one knew where he was. They hoped that someone would know anything, but they were met with nothing. By the end of November 1st, they reported Chris missing to the police. The police pretty much said that they couldn't do anything and figured that he would eventually show up. The very next day, the Jenkins family hired private investigator Chuck Lesh. The PI got to work immediately, meeting with family and friends to create the timeline that we just covered. He also got in contact with everyone working at the bar on Halloween night, but hit a major roadblock. The manager of the Lone Tree Bar and Grill made it very clear to the employees that if anyone spoke to the PI about that night, that they wouldn't have a job anymore. After getting nowhere with the people at the bar, Chuck then turned to video footage. The Federal Reserve Bank in Minneapolis sits facing the Hennepin Bridge and the Mississippi River, where most people figured Chris would have had to walk across to get home. Here's a quick map of Minneapolis. This is where the bar was, and this is where Chris lived. A walk home isn't entirely out of the question, as it would usually take around 15 or 20 minutes. This is the path that most people figured he took, and this is where the bank is. If Chris did walk home and cross this bridge, he would have been on camera. But according to the Federal Reserve, nobody matching Chris's description was seen crossing that bridge that night. A few other locations downtown were checked, but nothing. In a post-9/11 world where cameras are everywhere and everything is recorded, it was kind of surprising that Chris wasn't on any footage. It was almost as if he had vanished into thin air. The family would then bring in K9 bloodhounds on 2 separate occasions to see if they could find him, the first being 6 days after the disappearance, and the second a month later. The bloodhounds followed Chris's scent from the Lone Tree Bar out into the street and down the block, into a parking garage. The hounds led them to 2 specific parking spots, stalls 89 and 90. According to some reports, a red feather and a string matching Chris's costumes were found alongside a pool of blood. After speaking to a parking attendant, it was discovered that one of the parking spots was used by a bouncer from Lone Tree Bar on Halloween night. Apparently the hounds checked out the bouncer's car and had a mild hit of Chris's scent, but nothing was done to follow up with this. Leaving the parking garage, the hounds followed the scent in the middle lane of Hennepin, as if they were following a vehicle. The first search led them up and down the riverside, and surprisingly the second led them miles away, to a freeway. Now you may be wondering what the police were doing. And to that, I'd say fuck all. The police figured that he had simply run away and would return if he wanted to be found. The police were of no help to the family, and according to Jan Jenkins' book, at times seemed to actually be in opposition to the family's investigation. The police didn't even interview the friends that went to the bar with Chris that night. The only friend of Chris's that actually was interviewed was his girlfriend Ashley. According to Jan's book, the police acted really strangely when Chris first disappeared, almost as if they were hiding something. But Chris was gone, and no one knew anything. At least that's how it was until 4 months later. On February 27th, 2003, Chris Jenkins' body was found right behind me in the Mississippi River, just south of the 3rd Avenue Bridge. The body was frozen and attached to tree branches that would caught just before St. Anthony Falls. It had been 119 days since anyone had seen Chris, and there he was, in the river, wearing the same Halloween costume. An autopsy was performed soon after the discovery, revealing several key pieces of information. At the time of discovery, Chris's body was facing upwards with his arms across his chest. This was very unusual, as the leading theory at the time was that Chris drowned, and most drowning victims are found face down with their arms floating forward. The costume that Chris was wearing was also completely intact. His shirt was still tucked in, and his costume moccasins were still on his feet. The autopsy revealed that Chris's blood alcohol level was 0.12. After 4 months of decomposition, we can safely assume that he wasn't too drunk when he died, probably around 0.6 or just a few drinks. There were also trace amounts of GHB found in his system. GHB is commonly known as a date rape drug, but it also naturally occurs during decomposition, so the fact that this was in his system doesn't necessarily mean that he was drugged. There was also hair found in his left hand, labelled in the autopsy as foreign matter in left hand. DNA testing later confirmed the hair to be his own, but there are rumours that the testing may have been contaminated. And then finally, there were no noticeable bruises, broken bones, or lacerations found anywhere on his body. The family found this to be strange, as Chris was a lacrosse goalie and usually had bruises all over his body from the sport. Almost immediately, the police ruled Chris's death as unknown, but believed to be an accident or a suicide. And in 2004, they closed the case. The family followed a few more leads, turning to other private investigators, hydrologists, and even psychics, hoping to find out what happened to Chris. But nothing came of it. From that point on, the police stopped looking into it entirely. In the eyes of the police, the case was closed. Chris Jenkins had committed suicide. In November of 2006, the Minneapolis Police Department announced that Chris's death had been reclassified as a homicide. The newly instated police chief Tim Dolan publicly apologized to the Jenkins family, stating that the case was closed too quickly. On the same day of the announcement, the medical examiner also changed the manner of death from undetermined to homicide, which in my eyes is a bit odd. There weren't any new discoveries related to the autopsy publicly released, so why change this? The public doesn't know exactly why the case was reopened, but people speculate that it involved a man in prison who claimed to have been present during Chris's death. This man, Jeremy Lynn Alford, was in prison for another murder, but alleged that a friend of his had thrown Chris off the bridge after a botched robbery. In July of 2007, Hennepin County Attorney's Office approached to place charges on a person, but were denied. The ID of this person was never released, but it's assumed to be Mr. Alford. I requested information pertaining to this case directly from the police, but since it's still an open case and I'm just some guy, this was all that was given to me. Not a whole lot, but completely understandable. Now that we've got the timeline sorted and we've got all the facts, we can go ahead and dive into the theories. The first theory involves Jeremy Lynn Alford, the murderer that confessed in prison. According to some, he was a person of interest early on in the case, as Jeremy was a frequent patron of the Lone Tree Bar and Grill. If the assumption that he was the man that the attorney's office tried to place charges against, this theory holds a bit more weight. Jeremy was also reportedly part of a group known as the Dealers of Death, a group that has allegedly killed between 30 and 40 people over the years. Now, Jeremy confessed to witnessing his friend throw Chris off the bridge after a botched robbery, but based on the autopsy, we can safely assume that Chris did not fall off the bridge to end up in the river. The fact that he had no bruising, no broken bones, and that his slip-on shoes were still on his feet show that he did not fall in off the bridge. There are also no signs of a struggle. It seems very unlikely to me that anyone would be able to throw a 6-foot-tall athlete off a bridge without a significant fight. The second theory has to do with Mike Casey, the off-duty police officer. Now, what does Mike have to do with this? A lot more than you might think. Mike was one of the last people to see Chris alive. Mike was the one who pointed Chris out to the bouncers, which ultimately led to Chris being kicked out. In a statement given later in the investigation, Mike gave a very detailed recount on where Chris was, what he was doing, and who he was talking to. Now, why would Mike remember so many specific details about Chris on that night, unless he was actively observing him? Especially since he wasn't even supposed to be in the building, he was supposed to be working next door. But here's the kicker. Mike Casey wasn't just a random cop working security that night. Remember how I mentioned that Chris's girlfriend Ashley was dressed up as a sexy cop? Well, she was actually wearing Mike Casey's uniform shirt that night. Apparently they knew each other quite well, as Mike frequented the bar when she worked. According to reports, he was also seen flirting with Ashley all night. And finally, what I see as the nail in the coffin. The person that gave Ashley a ride home that night was Mike Casey himself. In my opinion, it's a little sus. The police never formally questioned him, stating, "He's a married man with children. We don't want to break up a family." Was the Minneapolis Police Department intentionally botching the case in order to cover for one of their own? I mean, possibly. I wouldn't put it past the corrupt institution that protects and serves to protect and serve one of their own. A theory that is pure speculation on my own part is that Chris's death may have resulted from a drug deal gone wrong. One detail that isn't often discussed when people cover this case is that Chris occasionally smoked weed. On Halloween, just before the party began, one of Chris's friends hurt his leg and asked Chris if he had any weed on him for the pain. Chris said that he didn't, but promised to be on the lookout for some. During a recent interview, Tony Norris, a bouncer that worked at the Lone Tree that night, claimed that Chris wasn't even kicked out. Tony also said that there were a few groups known to sell drugs that hung around the bar. My theory, if Tony is to be believed, and that's a big if, Chris may have left the Lone Tree Bar and Grill to go out and buy some weed, and then realised too late that he left his wallet in the bar with his girlfriend, which could have led to some trouble. This could explain why the bloodhounds followed Chris's scent down into the parking garage. I mean, it's a good enough place as any for a drug deal. This could also bring Jeremy Alford into the equation, possibly being part of the deal. But this is just my own theory, but it kind of makes sense to me. And then the final theory, that I won't spend too much time on, is the smiley face killers. This is a theory put together by retired New York detectives Kevin Gannon and Anthony Duarte. The theory tries to connect the deaths of 45 young men found in water all across the Midwest and states that they were all murdered by one or multiple serial killers. The theory derives its name from the belief that graffitied smiley faces were found near the bodies, which isn't true in a lot of the cases. Now, I will admit, the detectives' research on each case seemed to be very detailed and thorough, but I don't buy that the deaths are connected. At the time of Chris's death, there were quite a few disappearances of young men, which is quite strange, but besides the fact that some of them were recovered in bodies of water, there's not a whole lot to connect the cases. It seems like a lot of these men went missing after a night of drinking, and realistically, drunk men do dumb shit. Personally, I don't buy that there's a boogeyman offing college kids, but that's just my opinion. Now, looking at all the details, this is a very strange case that raises a few questions. Where was the body all that time? Why was he found facing upwards? Where were his bruises? Why was he clutching onto his own hair? And why didn't the police do more? Unfortunately, we don't have the answers to those questions. We've got a few theories, but that's about it. All we have is a tragic mystery that unfolded in Minneapolis on Halloween night in 2002. The case is still open, so if you have any information that may help this investigation, please reach out to the Minneapolis Police Department. Anonymous tips can be submitted to the Crime Stoppers of Minnesota at this link as well. If any of you guys have theories of your own, or want to leave what you think may have happened down in the comments, I'd love to read it. But please be safe this Halloween. Look out for yourself and your friends. Thank you for watching. Have a good one.